Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unworthy History. Today we got some more actual history for you from this book right here, Border Wars of Texas by James T. Deshields, published all the way back in 1912. So this is episode 6 in my series on this book, and in this episode we'll learn about some early interactions between Austin's colonists and the Waco and Tehuacanie Indian tribes. Then we'll hear about some of the early struggles of Green DeWitt's colony. As we have seen, the principal and most ferocious tribe with which Austin's colonists came into contact with on their arrival and for the first few years were the Comanches. But it was not long before the Wacos, Tawakonis, and allied tribes were depredating. In the spring of 1824, a party of Wacos went down the Brazos as far as the Kuykendall settlement, where they stole 13 head of valuable horses and escaped with their booty, having been pursued some 40 miles to the head of Cummings Creek, where the trail was lost. Following this successful raid, the Wacos again visited the settlements and stole all the horses of Mr. John Cummings. We followed the thieves as far as the Yewa, about 50 miles, says Kuykendall, where we lost the trail in consequence of the great number of wild horses and buffalo which then ranged through that section of the country. Many other depredations were committed by these Indians about this period, but details are too meager for record. In consequence of repeated thefts committed by the Wacos and Tehuacanis, Colonel Austin in July of 1824 sent Captain Islet C. Buckner with Judge Duke, James Baird, Thomas H. Borden, Selkirk, Jones, and McCloskey on a mission to treat with these tribes. They took with them some goods to barter with the Indians for horses. They crossed the Brazos at the San Antonio Road and proceeded up the river on the east side of the Tehuacanie village, crossing over to the Waco villages, the site of the present city of Waco. They were well received by the Indians, who had recently returned from their summer buffalo hunt, and were feasting on buffalo meat, green corn, and beans. They also had pumpkins and melons. They dwelt in comfortable lodges, conical in shape, the frames of which were cedar poles or slats thatched with grass. The largest of these lodges, their council house, was 59 paces in circumference. The Wacos and Tehuacani spoke the same language and were essentially the same people. Judge Duke estimated the two tribes would number between 200 and 300 warriors. They had a great number of horses and mules, a small plug of tobacco being the price of a horse, and a plug and a half that of a mule. They smoked the pipe of peace with the embassy, and pledged themselves to peace and amity with the colonists. The embassy remained with the Indians between 2 and 3 weeks, and returned home by the same route they went out. In the spring of 1826, Austin resolved to make a campaign against the Wacos and Tehuacanis, whose depredations had again become frequent. Rendezvousing on the Brazos at the crossing of the San Antonio Road, about the middle of May, a force of about 190 men was soon collected and organized. Colonel Austin in command, with Islet C. Buckner, Horatio Chrisman, Bartlett Sims, William Hall, and Ross Alley, captains of companies. The first day's march brought the expedition to the Little Brazos, where they left all provisions save rations for 3 days, and a forced march was ordered against the Indians. On arriving in the vicinity of the Indian encampment, scouts were sent to reconnoiter, and found it deserted. Appearances, says Kuykendall, indicated that the Tehuacanie village had been deserted about 2 weeks. The Waco village was on the west side of the river a little further up. We could not reach it as the river was much swollen, but ascertained that it too was uninhabited. The Indians were doubtless gone on a buffalo hunt. Their patches of corn were in silk and tassel. There was an abundance of beans, of which we picked a mess or two, but nothing was destroyed. Thus disappointed, and with their rations being entirely exhausted, the expedition returned to their supply depot, and to the Brazos where it was disbanded. As early as 1822, while Austin's colony was yet in its infancy, several American gentlemen, among them Green DeWitt of Missouri, appeared in the city of Mexico seeking impresario contracts. Owing to the unsettled political conditions of the country at that period, DeWitt's petition to settle 400 families in the province of Texas was not approved until after the promulgation and enactment of the first general colonization law of Coahuila and Texas on March 24, 1825. Anticipating the success of his application, which was duly granted on April 15, 1825, DeWitt had prearranged with Major James Kerr, late of Missouri but then of Austin's colony, as agent and surveyor for his colony. In August of that year, Major Kerr, having recently buried his wife and 2 children on the Brazos, with his black servant and 6 men, Erasmus Deaf Smith, Basil Durbin, Jaron Hines, John Whiteman, James Musick, and a man named Strickland, leaving San Felipe de Austin, reached a spot on Kerr's Creek near the present town of Gonzales, Texas, where they halted, speedily erected cabins, and laid off a site for the capital of the future colony, which was named Gonzales, in honor of Don Rafael Gonzales, the first governor of Coahuila and Texas. The location was most favorable, but the town itself was of slow growth and for a while of uncertain existence, as will be seen. The survey of lands for future colonists was prosecuted as rapidly as possible, says Brown, and a few weeks later Francis Berry and family settled near the creek. Of this family were also John and Betsy Oliver, grown children of Mrs. Berry by a former husband. About the 1st of October, DeWitt arrived from Saltillo and remained in the colony for 3 or 4 weeks before proceeding on his way to Missouri. During the year, a number of prospectors visited the country and after selecting locations left to return later. Thus, these few brave settlers at Old Gonzales in 1825 and 1826 were truly pioneers, the advance guards of American civilization on that then remote and greatly exposed frontier, their nearest neighbors being De Leon and half a dozen Mexicans at the infant settlements of Guadalupe, Victoria, 60 miles southward, and with no roads in any direction save their own freshly made trail to the Colorado River, 65 miles east. But the lot of these isolated settlers was not intolerable, and would have speedily improved but for an unexpected calamity. Parties of Indians professing friendship frequently called, passing to and fro and demonstrating no signs of hostility. The colonists apprehended no danger. Thus matters stood, says historian Brown, when the first day of July 1826 arrived. There was a celebration of the 4th of July at Bison's, at the Atascocito crossing of the Colorado River, a few miles below the present town of Columbus. Major Kerr had gone on a buffalo hunt. It was agreed that Basil Durbin, John and Betsy Oliver, and Jack, the servant boy of Kerr, should go on horseback to the Colorado celebration. They started out on Sunday, July 2nd, and encamped for the night on Thorn's Branch, 14 miles east, having no apprehension of danger at the time. The little party, however, were doomed to disappointment. For about midnight, while soundly sleeping on their blankets, they were suddenly aroused by the firing of guns and the yells of Indians. Durbin was shot in the shoulder by a musket ball, and badly wounded, but escaped with his companions into a thicket nearby, the horses and other effects being left in the possession of the enemy. From loss of blood and intense pain, Durbin repeatedly swooned, but he was restored by the efforts of his companions and enabled to walk by noon on the following day back to Major Kerr's cabin, where the party was astonished to find John Whiteman lying dead and scalped in the passageway between the rooms, and the house robbed of everything, including important papers and 3 compasses, and that an unsuccessful attempt had been made to burn it. They hurried to Berry's cabin and found it closed, and on the door written with charcoal, "Gone to Burnham's on the Colorado." When Durbin and his companions left on the previous day, Strickland, Musick, and Major Kerr's servants, Shade, Anise, and their 4 or 5 children, went to Berry's to spend the afternoon, leaving Whiteman alone at the cabins. Returning later in the day, they found Whiteman as described, yet warm in his own blood. Hurrying back to Berry's with the tidings, the entire party started for the Colorado River, where they safely arrived and were a few days later joined by Deaf Smith and Hines. Durbin's wounds had already rendered him very weak, but his only alternative was to reach the same place on foot or perish by the way. The weather was warm and there was imminent danger of gangrene making its appearance in his wound, to prevent which it was kept poulticed with mud and oak juice. Leaning on Betsy Oliver's arm, he arrived at Burnham's on the afternoon of the 6th, 3 days and a half after starting from the place. Durbin's wounds soon healed, the musket ball remaining in his shoulder until his death, and he lived to participate in a number of other adventures. 7 years later, he received 6 rifle balls in his person at one time, and, as if he bore a charmed life, survived, carrying 7 balls in his body until his death in 1858. Thus was DeWitt's colony, like Austin's at the mouth of the Colorado, christened with blood, and thus for the moment ended the first efforts to found a settlement within its limits. Following these events, Major Kerr and a few companions moved to a point on the west bank of the Lavaca River, now in Jackson County, where blockhouses were built and a nucleus formed for the revival of the enterprise. The place, only temporarily occupied for defensive and rallying purposes, was subsequently known as the Old Station. Major Kerr established his permanent home on the east bank of the Lavaca, near the station. On the 12th of December, 1826, Major Kerr, under the authority invested in him as Surveyor General, commissioned Bird Lockhart as Deputy Surveyor of the colony, a judicious selection, and the survey of land, despite danger from hostile Indians, proceeded with all reasonable dispatch, and emigrants continued to arrive and locate near the station on the Lavaca River. DeWitt, with his family, arrived at the old station in October of 1827, and during the succeeding winter, with his own and a number of other families, reported to Gonzales and its vicinity, and then, with the opening of the year 1828, began the permanent settlement of the region destined to become the Lexington of Texas in the Revolution of 1835 and 1836. The venerable pioneer Noah Smithwick, who visited DeWitt's colony in the summer of 1828, in a letter to the author from his last home at Santa Ana, California, a few months before his death on October 21, 1899, gives the following pen picture of colonial life at that period. The colonists, consisting of a dozen families, were living, if such existence could be called living, huddled together for security against the Indians. The rude log cabins, windowless and floorless, have been so often described as the abode of the pioneer as to require no description here. Suffice it to say that save as a partial protection against rain and sun, they were absolutely devoid of comfort. Colonel DeWitt, my host, had bread, though some of the families were without. Flour was $10 a barrel, but few people had money to buy anything more than coffee and tobacco. Money was as scarce as bread. Game was plentiful the year round, so there was no need of starving. Men talked hopeful of the future. Children reveled in the novelty of the present, and the women bore their part with heroic endurance. Deprived of friends and former comforts, they had not even the solace of constant employment. The spinning wheel and loom had been left behind, for there was as yet no use for them because there was nothing to spin. There was no house to keep in order. The meager fare was so simple as to require little time for its preparation. There was no poultry, no dairy, no garden, no books or papers, and had there been, many of them could not read. No schools, no churches, nothing to break the dull monotony of their lives, save an occasional attack from Indians, the howl of some wild animal, or the stampede of a herd of buffalo or mustangs. As early as May 1824, the Mexican Congress had passed an act temporarily combining the provinces of Coahuila and Texas into a state, with a provisional legislature, Don Rafael Gonzales being elected governor, and in March of 1825, as we have seen, the newly formed government promulgated a general state colonization law. The fame and success of Austin and his colony, together with the more liberal provisions of the new Colonization Act, induced a number of persons to seek impresario privileges. Among those who secured grants and fulfilled or attempted to carry out their contracts were Robert Leftwich of Nashville, Tennessee, permission given on April 15, 1825 to settle 900 families in what was afterwards known as Robertson's Colony. Hayden Edwards, a Kentuckian, then resident of Louisiana, concession given on April 18, 1825 to settle 800 families in the Nacogdoches district of East Texas, and Don Martin de Leon, a native Mexican but then and since 1805 residing in the province of Texas, concession given on October 6, 1825 to settle 41 Mexican families south of DeWitt's colony and between the La Vaca and Guadalupe rivers. A number of other concessions were made about this period to parties who failed of success, notably to Ben R. Milam, the famous hero of San Antonio, to settle 200 families north of the old San Antonio Road and between the Colorado and Guadalupe rivers. But brave Milam was a soldier rather than civilian, and sacrificed his life in a more glorious cause, on the altar of liberty, falling in the moment of victory. Thus the spirit of colonization was infused throughout the whole Southwest, and a constant tide of immigration was flowing into Texas, giving to the country some assurance of permanent prosperity and stability. So that's it for this episode. Here, some of the early settlers of DeWitt's colony were attacked and killed by Indians near Gonzales, Texas around the 4th of July, 1826. And we heard about this one colonist named Durbin who survived being shot here, and he would later survive after being shot 6 times at once. So in the next episode in this series, we'll hear about Hayden Edwards' colony and the Fredonian War. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.